This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The opioid epidemic continues within the COVID-19 pandemic. Connecticut reported a 14% increase in opioid overdose deaths when compared to last year. Nationally, overdose deaths increased by double that. And to get an idea of the sheer number of lives lost, the CDC says 500,000 people have died from opioid overdoses from 2009 to 2019. Now, pharmaceutical company Purdue Pharma, based in Stamford, has been at the center of the opioid crisis. The company manufactured the painkiller OxyContin, aggressively marketed it, minimizing its addictiveness, and leading to thousands of lawsuits. Now, a federal judge has overturned a $4.5 billion settlement between the drug maker and state, local, and tribal governments, saying the agreement in bankruptcy court was wrong to release the billionaire Sackler family and the company's owners from civil lawsuits. Today, Where We Live, what happens now? And how is Purdue Pharma continuing to profit? And later, how do we prevent a similar crisis in corporate governance? You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. First, joining us on Zoom is William Tong, Connecticut's Attorney General. Welcome back to the show.
Happy holidays.
So your reaction to this settlement being overturned, we know Connecticut and other states, including the District of Columbia, appealed that settlement. Tell us why.
Yeah, it was just 9 of us, 8 states and the district and the Department of Justice. This is seismic. This is a huge victory for victims and their families and survivors, and a huge victory for justice and accountability. You know, at the end of the day, the Sacklers are going to pay, under this proposed bankruptcy plan, less than 5% on their money. And as far as I can tell, no Sackler is going to have to sell a boat or a car or a piece of art or a piece of jewelry. And that's just wrong. I pay more than 5% on my car loan. And we need to hold the Sacklers accountable. We need to bring them to justice and to make them pay for all the damage and destruction they've wrought on our state and across the country.
People point also to the fact that this Purdue settlement money would have helped fund treatment for opioid use disorder, and some say the sooner the funding gets here, the better. So what's your response to that?
Well, 2 things. Number one, we do need resources for treatment and prevention, and we're going to get that. I brokered a $26 billion settlement along with my fellow AGs with the 3 major drug distributors in Johnson & Johnson, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal, McKesson, and Johnson & Johnson. That is the second largest cash settlement in history, second only to the tobacco case. And that will bring more than $300 million to Connecticut, and that money will start to flow next year. But Lucy, this isn't just about the money. My job is not just to sue companies and bring money into Connecticut. My job is to pursue justice. And this is a law enforcement action. Connecticut is holding the Sacklers accountable for the more than 1,300 families, close to 1,400 families that this holiday season will have an empty chair at the dining room table or in the living room. And the more than $10 billion that the Sacklers and Purdue have done to Connecticut's economy every single year. So it's not just about the money. It's about justice. It's about the 2 moms I had last Thursday in my office right before this decision was announced. 2 moms who between them have lost 3 sons, and no amount of money is going to bring them back.
You mentioned that $26 billion settlement that you helped broker, and the U.S. Senator Chris Murphy and others encouraging Connecticut towns and cities to join in this national opioid settlement. I think there's a January 2nd deadline to participate. You mentioned the lives lost and the financial costs to fight this crisis. But I'm wondering if you can talk more about, when we think about the billions that this settlement would have provided, but when you, I guess, quantify the cost of care, the cost for counseling, the cost on families who are still struggling with a loved one that's dealing with opioid abuse disorder, if you could talk more about the personal sacrifice that families have been dealing with.
Well, two things that really strike me as pivotal in these cases, and as we try to confront what I believe is the worst public health crisis in America, COVID notwithstanding. Number one, the true toll, the true amount of damage, the cost of this is unknowable. You'd be hard pressed to find anybody in this state who hasn't been touched in some way by this crisis. You'd be hard pressed to find anybody who hasn't lost somebody close to them, because it really touches everybody in every community. The second thing is I have spent a lot of time with victims, survivors, and their families, and I hear extraordinary stories of triumph, of people who were prescribed way too much medication when they were kids, when they were teenagers, for an accident or an injury, and then they fall into addiction and they go to hell and back, and they're in recovery and they're doing great, and they've overcome tremendous challenges. But as I've talked to so many victims and people in recovery, you also understand that this is a lifetime walk that we need to take with them, a lifetime challenge, a lifetime burden and struggle, and not everybody's going to make it. And that's the real tragedy here, is that people will do extraordinarily well and still they won't make it. Still they will fall victim to addiction and to this crisis that was started in large part by a family driven by greed here in our own home state of Connecticut. And people ask me, other AGs, people working in this crisis, working in these cases, you're the home state attorney general, William. What does that mean to you? And what I say is, it means I have a special obligation to be aggressive and hold them accountable.
You're hearing William Tong, Connecticut's Attorney General, here on Where We Live as we talk about Purdue Pharma. You can join us 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're familiar with all of the claims from this drug maker, Attorney General Tong. Purdue Pharma claiming only 4% of the opioid market was made up of OxyContin at its peak. And so can you talk about that and the ripple effect? Because we know that when we think about opioid use disorder and people that are dying from accidental overdoses, the ripple effect when we think about fentanyl and heroin.
Yeah, here's what we know. We know that thousands of people are dying. We know that the Sacklers aggressively, deceptively marketed a drug, fraudulently marketed a drug to people in Connecticut and across the country. They were pill pushers, drug pushers, and they didn't care what happened to people. They willfully denied the evidence about addiction and about the highly addictive nature of their product. They blamed victims. They said the reason why people were addicted was because they had a pseudo addiction, and under their theory that if they just got more drugs, that they wouldn't feel the need or the craving. So the Sacklers claimed that the real problem was that people weren't getting enough medicine. And that just sounds obviously so wrong and sick to people when we hear the Sacklers make these sorts of claims about victims and blaming people who have fallen into addiction. We know that in 2007, the Sacklers pled guilty, or not the Sacklers, unfortunately, but Purdue Pharma and 3 senior executives pled guilty to federal criminal charges. And it was at that point in 2007 that the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma, they had the opportunity to acknowledge that they helped to start this fire, and they could help the states and local communities and healthcare providers and doctors help to put this out. But instead, they poured gasoline on it, and now this fire rages across Connecticut and across country.
So what more can you do as a Connecticut Attorney General? You don't have the authority to pursue criminal charges against the Sacklers, but in terms of working with others who do have that power, Attorney General Tong.
Yeah, there is tremendous power in working with my fellow attorneys general across the country. There isn't a state or an attorney general who isn't actively engaged in this work. It's a very small group of us, and I helped to lead the 9 of us that said, no, the settlement proposed by the Sacklers is not good enough. The Purdue Pharma bankruptcy doesn't cut it. They need to be held accountable. And we stepped out and appealed the bankruptcy judge's decision, giving the Sacklers a lifetime of immunity. We won. That was a big win, but there's still much more fight to be had in this case. We expect Purdue and the Sacklers to appeal. We will meet them in the Court of Appeal in the Second Circuit, United States Court of Appeals, And I'm confident we will beat them there too. And if we have to, we will go to the U.S. Supreme Court to hold them accountable. I'm going to keep fighting. And it's not just on Purdue. It's not just on the Sacklers. It's not just on the distributors and Johnson & Johnson. There's an addiction industry out there that makes money off of people's misery. And I'm going to continue to pursue them, to hold them accountable. I expect that for as long as I'm Attorney General, and as long as the people of this state will honor me with this responsibility, I will be doing this work and going after people responsible for this crisis.
That's a Connecticut Attorney General William Tong here on Where We Live. We wanted to get more context on the settlement that was overturned. Joining us now on Zoom is Josh Silverstein, professor of law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
We just heard Attorney General Tong say Purdue Pharma is expected to appeal. And so can you talk about this legal process? How long could it last before maybe another agreement is reached?
It's a good question. Bankruptcy works a little bit differently than a regular lawsuit. Normally, you've got three levels in a lawsuit. There's the trial court, there's the appellate court, and then you can appeal to the Supreme Court. Those Supreme Courts regularly have discretion whether to take the case. In bankruptcy, there's a fourth level. So you start at the bankruptcy court, then you generally go to the trial court, then the appellate court, and then possibly the Supreme Court. So we've only finished the second level. Next, as Attorney General Tong explained, there'll be an appeal to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. That could take a year or more. And then the Supreme Court could take this case. While the Supreme Court gets to choose which cases it's going to hear, this would be a really good vehicle to finally address the power of bankruptcy courts to grant the type of immunity the Sacklers have received, because the courts disagree about that. So I wouldn't be surprised if this lasted a couple of more years and we ended up before the U.S. Supreme Court.
When we talk about, this federal judge finding the bankruptcy court doesn't have the authority to approve legal immunity for people who did not declare bankruptcy, break that down for us.
Normally, when a party declares bankruptcy, they're entitled to what's called a discharge. And what the discharge does is eliminate all of the liability that the debtor, the bankrupt person, had prior to declaring bankruptcy, with a few exceptions that aren't really relevant right now for our purposes in this case. But the person who gets that discharge is only the person that declares bankruptcy. It could be an individual, it could be a business, but it's the party that declares bankruptcy that gets that discharge. Well, about 35 years ago, courts started granting what is called a non-debtor release to parties that are related to the debtor. The classic example being shareholders of a company that declares bankruptcy were getting these non-debtor releases. And a non-debtor release is similar to a discharge in that it's an elimination of liability, but it goes to the non-debtor, the party related to the debtor, like a shareholder or a director or officer. And so that party gets an elimination of some of their liability. It's generally not comprehensive. The discharge eliminates everything. Most non-debtor releases are only extinguishing specific claims, like claims against the director or officer related to the bankrupt debtor. And courts have started granting these non-debtor releases, but there's a split over whether that type of relief is allowed. No question a debtor can get a discharge, but can a non-debtor get the equivalent of a partial discharge, eliminating some of its liability? That's where the courts have been in disagreement for over 30 years.
Meanwhile, Josh, there's this proposed Sackler Act in Congress that would prevent protections for owners in similar situations. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. And in the interest of disclosure, I've helped with the drafting of that statute. The Sackler Act would essentially ban non-debtor releases, and it would also ban some other types of orders that bankruptcy courts have issued over the last 30 years that are not as extensive as non-debtor releases, but grant similar types of relief. And so basically the Sackler Act would simply ban non-debtor releases. And since the bankruptcy code is a statute, it can be amended like any other statute. And if the Sackler Act passes, that would moot the issue in terms of the authority of bankruptcy courts to grant non-debtor releases. They would be barred going forward. But it probably wouldn't impact the Sackler case because generally statutes only apply moving forward. They don't apply backward looking or retroactively. So there's a good chance that even if the Sackler Act passes, it won't impact the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy and any of the non-debtor releases in that case.
You're hearing Josh Silverstein here on Where We Live, professor of law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Josh, thank you for that context. We appreciate your perspective.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And also here with us was Connecticut Attorney General William Tong. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lucy.
Coming up after the break, we're going to talk about how Purdue Pharma is still benefiting from opioid drugs like OxyContin. We talk about that coming up, and you can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or share a comment or question on Facebook, or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're focused on Stanford-based Purdue Pharma. It also has a subsidiary based in the UK, drug maker Mundipharma International. Mundipharma has a presence in 120 countries. That's according to Reuters. It offers drugs for pain management and other diseases. And the company's China unit is now up for sale and could earn the Sackler family more than $1 billion. Painkiller OxyContin is one of Mundipharma's core products in China. A Mundipharma spokesperson declined to provide sales and profit data for OxyContin. In a statement to Where We Live, Jan Milton Edwards says, "We provide Nixoid at cost and do not make any profit from it. Nixoid is a nasal spray that contains naloxone for emergency treatment to reverse opioid overdose." Now, the Sacklers will own the subsidiary until the restructuring and settlement plan of Purdue Pharma is effective. And once that settlement is in place, Milton Edwards went on to say, "Our shareholders intend to sell Mundipharma within 7 years. But we just heard the bankruptcy settlement stalled. So how much longer will it take to sell Mundipharma?" Joining us now is Stephen Woods. He's an acute care nurse practitioner in Boston, a visiting researcher at Harvard Law School, and he's here to talk more about the Sacklers' ongoing sales of opioids in overseas markets. Steve Woods, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on today.
Now, we're talking about OxyContin and the Sacklers, but before that, they sold a pill dubbed Mother's Little Helper. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so, the Sackler family, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler, they were, three Jewish immigrants. They came from Poland. They were came from a fairly poor family. All of them went to medical school. All of them went on to psychiatry, but they did do some wonderful things during their time as practitioners. But Arthur, really, kind of left, as a practitioner and started focusing more on advertising. And he was really the first to come up with direct advertising to physicians. And one of the first drugs that he was involved with was a drug called diazepam or Valium, and this drug was marketed directly to both providers, but also to housewives who were feeling stressors of being home, having many responsibilities as a housewife, and so Valium was kind of that quote unquote glass of Chardonnay at the end of the day. And sales of that drug rocketed because of his involvement. And he took, basically that methodology, which is, really focusing on both provider and consumer, and carried that over to OxyContin, as we know.
When we talk about what Purdue Pharma knew about OxyContin being highly addictive and minimizing that risk when it was aggressively marketed. Also, Purdue and Mundipharma executives were alerted to concerns surrounding addiction as far back as 1996. There were minutes from a meeting held in Switzerland in May 6th. Mundipharma executives met with a leading Swiss physician. This Dr. Dayer is quoted as saying OxyContin for back pain is not regarded as suitable indication for opioids in Europe, and this indication is accompanied by a psychological factor which holds a risk for addiction if opioids are used for treatment. Your response to that, Steve?
Well, we've long known opioids are addictive, and OxyContin is basically oxycodone, which is an opiate that has been around for decades, and it's just an extended release formulation. It's just the packaging, so there's no difference in the degree of addiction that we're going to see. I think they didn't have any data to support this. They simply theorized that an extended release might reduce the degree by which people become addicted. But we've known for centuries that opioids are an addictive agent, and that hasn't changed. And OxyContin, the increasing dosages that were associated with this, delayed release really, negated any idea that this would be less addictive. I don't think that we should be fooled that they didn't think this was going to be an addictive agent. We've known, as I mentioned, for centuries that's the case. And if they felt that way, then they should have pursued academic research to demonstrate that, and they didn't. Instead, they decided to forego that and just make these claims and heavily marketed that drug with that claim.
Again, you're hearing Steve Wood here on Where We Live, a bioethicist and visiting researcher at the Harvard Law School. We read a statement from Mundipharma about the company selling Nixoid, if I'm saying that correct, which contains naloxone, an emergency drug to reverse overdosing. Some would argue, why is this company allowed to sell this drug? And really, what can be done about it, Steve?
Yeah, so this, actually Purdue actually attempted this here in the United States as well. They had something called Project Tango, and their idea was to be, an end-to-end, for the consumer. So they would sell the OxyContin and other pain medications, and then on the back end, they'd be offering buprenorphine and naloxone and other agents to manage, both treatment and overdose. In China, and what Mundipharma is doing is that, this Nixoid, this is not a novel drug. This is naloxone. And naloxone, or, the brand name Narcan, has been, it was patented in 1961. It was always very cheap. It's always been used in the setting of opioid overdose. What these companies are doing are claiming that the delivery system, which is a nasal spray, is something novel. And so initially they were charging, in excess of what it costs to manufacture that drug, which is just pennies. Now they're offering it at cost because they're saying that they're doing this, in response to the opioid epidemic. But in reality, they're still profiting from their OxyContin sales. So this is just a really not, what they're stating, which is that they're really, putting some effort and putting some interest in preventing preventing overdose. They're still heavily marketing OxyContin in China. This is just, kind of a safety net, and offering it at cost really doesn't harm them in any way. And in fact, they probably are still profiting in some degree, especially where they, have a quote unquote novel nasal spray, which I'm sure all of us, who live in this area have a nasal spray at home. There's nothing novel about that. It's just it's the same delivery system that has been used for decades. So I think that if Mundipharma and Purdue truly wanted to end this epidemic, the solution is not a treatment for overdose, right? That means that you're well beyond, addiction. The treatment for this would be stopping sales of this drug, stopping the aggressive marketing of this drug, and then really investing in research on what is effective treatment for opioid use disorder.
When you talk about stopping the sale of this drug, I remember when we started covering this crisis, several years back, getting an email from a woman who is dealing with pain, chronic pain every day. I'm not sure what her condition was, but feeling that, that her ability to get this painkiller has become harder, and this idea that people that are really living with pain, that they do need suitable treatment. And so how do we make sure that we don't forget about those people in this, again, very important conversation about making sure that if we know something is addictive, to help people, but to not lead them on this path that can lead to opioid use disorder, Steve?
That is absolutely true. And I have a strong interest actually in that patient population, especially the palliative care patients who really do require opioids. Opioids are the best analgesic we have. They're the best pain reliever we have. However, the indications for these drugs has really become, overblown. And this all started with, the fifth vital sign of pain. And so that anyone who had any amount of pain was going to receive an opioid. And what we found is that indication is overblown, and that, there are other safer alternatives for people who have pain that doesn't necessarily require opioid analgesia. And so if we can refocus on the conditions that we consider opioid analgesia, I think that will be of benefit to those patients who are having difficulty finding them. We certainly should be making sure that patients with, cancer pain and patients that need palliative care, that they're the ones that are getting the opioids. We found that there's no indication, for these drugs for chronic back pain, for other chronic conditions that respond better to acetaminophen, to other NSAIDs, and that don't really require opioids. If we refocus as a medical community on identifying that patient population that will be best served with opioids, then I think we can solve that issue.
You can join our conversation here on Where We Live, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Earlier in the show, we were talking about this delay in settlement money to fund the treatment of opioid use disorder. I'm wondering if you can talk about, when we think about the cost, as Attorney General Tong mentioned, it's hard to quantify, right? When we think about not just the financial cost of this crisis, but the toll it has taken on families, and families that are still struggling, and the fact that their loved ones may not be getting the proper treatment or care, or there's waiting lists. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that and what this delay in funding could mean.
Sure. So the problem I have is that we really don't know what effective treatment for opioid use disorder is. Mm-hmm. So while this money is becoming available, the current treatments that we have simply aren't working very well. I've worked in both the emergency department setting, and I've worked in the intensive care unit, and I've spoken to many, users of opioids. There's always underlying trauma. There's always underlying mental illness. But oftentimes those disorders, opioid use disorder and mental illness, are treated separately. And so we aren't really effectively managing opioid use disorder. And so granted, there are going to be millions of dollars, infused into treatment programs, but we don't yet know what treatment programs work. And the ones that we do have some idea as being effective, and that's actually, drug replacement therapy using either methadone or, Suboxone. Those are very highly restricted. You need a special license to prescribe them. If you're on methadone, you need to show up at a clinic every day. We don't treat any other disease this way. If you have diabetes, you don't have to show up at a clinic every day to get your insulin. You don't. If you have other diseases, you can be prescribed these medications at home. And so, as I'm encouraged by the millions of dollars that are going to be coming into the system to help with opioid use disorder, but we really need to get a good grasp on what will work, and we don't have good data on that yet. And so I worry that these millions of dollars are going to come in. They're going to be infused into programs that aren't working, like the 3 or 4 day detoxes, abstinence programs, programs that don't deal with both disorders, that being mental health and substance use. and that we're going to waste these funds and that we're going to misappropriate this funding, and we're going to be, right where we're at. We've already seen, despite years of effort, the numbers have gone up. During this past year, the numbers went from 80,000 to 100,000 opioid related deaths. And so what we're doing isn't working. Money can fix that, but only if we spend the money the right way.
These are all important points, Steve, that you mentioned, getting back to Suboxone and Methadone, the fact that they have to go to particular clinics to receive this treatment. Why is that still in 2021? Why has there not been changes to how there's access to these particular treatments?
Well, that comes down to the concern that we're just putting more opioid into the market. And so I did a lot of research on why do you need a special license to prescribe Suboxone? I can prescribe opioids having only an hour or two of education on those drugs in my training. Yet if I wanted to prescribe Suboxone, I had to take a 24-hour course to do that. And so I think what I found digging through many documents was that Congress was afraid that this would be yet another opioid pumped into the system that would possibly create some harm. And so they felt that by restricting that, they would have at least a grapple on access to this drug. That's not the case, right? So we know that people will take buprenorphine, which is the active kind of agonist antagonist opioid in Suboxone, and they will use that as a substitute for opioids. They're selling that as a substitute for opioids. So what we're doing isn't particularly working. If it became more accessible and if it became more acceptable as a drug, I think then those problems would go away. And the other piece of that puzzle is, well, then why, if we were concerned about this particular drug, these drug replacement therapies that we have real good data as being effective for helping people through addiction, why weren't we more restrictive with OxyContin or oxycodone or Dilaudid or any of these other drugs? All the things that we've done to try to make it more restrictive have failed. And that includes, prescription monitoring programs and, campaigns about, reducing prescription. It just isn't working. And so I think that, if we can make this drug more available, more accessible, and more acceptable as a treatment, as a therapy, then I think it will be safer all around, and will make some headway into treating addiction.
Mm-hmm. One more for you. When you say making this treatment more acceptable, is there stigma that still surrounds Suboxone and Methadone?
Yeah, so there's stigma not only with providers. So I think a lot of providers, because of the restrictiveness of this medication, so because you have to take this extra course, because there needs to be certain elements in place before you prescribe it, there's some stigma among providers. They're not feeling comfortable with its use because of all the the restrictions around it. When it's actually a very simple drug to administer, very safe and effective. And there's also stigma amongst people with opioid use disorder. So we've made abstinence the goal for everybody, but that's not always going to work, and that's not always the best approach. And so until we say abstinence doesn't need to be the goal for everybody, that this drug replacement therapy is safe, it doesn't make you any worse of a person if you require this drug to manage your symptoms. And in fact, it's going to make you a better person because you're going to be on a prescribed program that's monitored by either a physician, a PA, or an NP. And so I think that stigma has been created by us as providers because of the restrictions, but also because of our that we're dictating that abstinence is really the only key, when we know that that isn't going to work. This is a chronic and relapsing disease with a large percentage of recidivism, and so we know these therapies are effective, that many people can be on them for long periods of time, if not their entire life. and it's effective. And so we need to really kind of shift the paradigm and ensure that people realize this is a safe drug, it's effective. If you have to be on it for your life, that's okay. It's going to be the treatment that keeps you, from relapsing into using, fentanyl or heroin or other drugs.
You're hearing Steve Wood here on Where We Live, bioethicist and acute care nurse practitioner and a visiting researcher at Harvard Law School. He'll stay with us after the break. We're going to talk about corporate governance, too. You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, Where We Live producer Abhi Levine looked into payments made by Purdue Pharma to physicians and teaching hospitals in Connecticut. That's $60 million between 2014 and 2020. Fewer physicians accepting Purdue money in recent years. That's according to the Open Payments database by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Purdue dollars also went into hedge funds. Sunriver Management and Stanford redeemed investments by a private Sackler investment firm last year, partly to disassociate itself from the family. That's according to the Wall Street Journal. And amid the falling out, a website called Judge for Yourselves attempts to absolve the Sacklers from the opioid crisis. A spokesperson for that website did not respond to our request for comment. Now, what role does corporate governance and ethics play in the pharma industry? Joining us now on Zoom is Alexa Dietrich, Research Associate Professor at Wagner College in the Department of Culture and Economy. Alexa, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
And just to be clear, Wagner did not receive funding from Purdue. Alexa, we wanted to play a clip from a man profiled in a Netflix 4-part docuseries titled The Pharmacist. This was featuring a real-life pharmacist, Dan Schneider. He's from a small town in Louisiana. His 22-year-old son was shot dead while attempting to buy crack cocaine in New Orleans. That grief led Schneider to drug dealers, a pill mill doctor, and Purdue Pharma, all in an effort to help save lives. Schneider spoke with Where We Live senior producer Sujata Srinivasan, recalling his efforts to convince Purdue to reduce the addictive effects of OxyContin. Let's just take a listen to this.
Another company had actually had a drug that they had an abuse potential with, and when they found out, they added naloxone or NX to the drug. The drug name was Talwin, and they made it Talwin NX. It reduced the abuse potential quite a bit. Of course, their sales went down. But what I did was I told the OxyContin manufacturer, which was a female vice president with Purdue, I said, y'all could add NX to OxyContin. You could call it OxyContin NX. And then if it was chewed or injected, the drug would be nullified. The people wouldn't get as a big a high. There wouldn't be as much addiction, and there surely wouldn't be as much death. And she said, well, we've heard that before, and we're looking into doing that. Well, I hate to say it, I don't think they were sincere in that. It took them all the way from 2002 to 2010 before they made an effort to make it less abusable. And even then, they still didn't use or add naloxone to it. And I firmly believe it's because adding naloxone to it would have done what happened to Talwin NX, which means their sales would have went down. They were more interested in sales than saving lives.
Alexa Dietrich, respond to what we just heard. And, when we think about corporate governance practices that should have been in place for Dan and apparently others when they wanted to work towards changing this corporate culture at Purdue.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of layers to this question of how we as a society regulate corporations, and particularly in the pharmaceutical case. And so there are legal questions and there are also social questions. And one of the things I think that we don't pay enough attention to are the different types of social influence and how that's wielded. So as was mentioned in the clip, there's this question about pharmaceutical companies should be saving lives, right? That's what they say they do. And they get a lot of credit and a lot of leeway because they're not considered a harm industry like other kinds of industries. They're considered to be an industry that does good. And so not only do political entities that may be regulating them or legal entities that have choices about whether or not they prosecute them take that into account, but also we in society are a little bit hesitant to push down too hard on them because we look at them as entities that produce life-saving drugs. And so I think that that's something we don't talk about enough. And there are a lot of different kinds of this influence, both at elite levels and also at lower levels. And sometimes it's influence that's literally cash in hand in some ways, whether through lobbying or other kinds of benefits given to doctors who prescribe. But also, there are other kinds of ways in which the public relations aspects of their operations do a really good job of convincing us that they're necessary and that they need to be allowed to do whatever it is they need to do.
When we think about corporate giving, would separating pharma corporations from foundations help prevent this conflict of interest, Alexa?
It's actually a really interesting question. And in the Purdue case specifically, something I think that we'll all have to wait and see what happens is that part of the settlement, which has been being talked about throughout the show, part of that settlement actually specifically targeted their philanthropy. So the settlement stipulated that the Sackler family would lose control of their foundations and also put limitations on the abilities of the family to put its name on certain things like buildings and hospitals, even in their private donations. So it remains to be seen if the settlement comes undone, whether or not that component will also have sort of a second life in whatever comes afterwards. But so I think that there was a recognition in that settlement of this need to kind of separate this type of philanthropy and the name recognition piece from companies, including pharmaceutical companies. And it's important to mention that pharmaceutical companies in general, the Sacklers are a special case with Purdue, but in general, the foundations, what they call foundations in their philanthropies, are not really separate entities. They're really just part of the PR arm of these companies, which is different than a lot of foundations that we think about. For example, the Ford Foundation is not related to the Ford Motor Company anymore. So pharmaceutical companies are a bit of an interesting case in that way, that those things are intimately related. And so their donations explicitly focus on areas of interest to their companies, as well as things that are explicitly dedicated to shoring up their reputation. So if there were ways to separate them out and make their governance separate, their decision-making power separate, and in an ideal case, their names or other kinds of associations separate, I do think it would be helpful.
There's a question from a caller. Before we get to that, Tony, stay with us. Steve Wood is still here, acute care nurse practitioner, a visiting researcher at Harvard Law School. Steve, related to this conversation with Alexa, I understand you were part of a campaign to get Harvard University to return donations from the Sackler family. Where we live, contact representatives from schools in our state, Yale and University of Connecticut, both of which receive funding from Purdue Pharma. We received an email from UConn that wrote in part, no new funding has been received from the Sacklers. The only current use of funds gifted by the Sacklers in the past is currently being used to keep an employee employed and for some research to continue to its conclusion. We didn't hear back from Yale. How do you respond to that statement from UConn and other schools when we think about the way the money has been used?
Yeah, I think, my involvement was minimal. It was really, student oriented. It was the students at Harvard who really, put that effort forward. But I certainly helped write some letters and participated in this because I think that we do have to be careful about, we were looking, at how providers are utilizing this money and accepting, money and trips and things of that nature for these prescribing purposes. But, when we think about institutions and the amount of funding that they've received, I think there needs to be I think this is a good, start to provide more transparency to this process. I find it a little hard to believe that these universities, didn't put more thought into these processes. But when you're talking about millions of dollars, it's pretty tempting, to accept those funds, for research purposes, for buildings, for other things. I think that, the money's been spent. I don't think that, there's any going back. I think that the funding's been spent. I think, what we have to do is let what's been done dry up. And I do feel, I read the same article about, this research person at UConn, and this is supporting their salary. But, there needs to be a way then to figure out how do we do that without, this funding. And if this is really important research, maybe that funding needs to be, moved from one pot to another if we want to support that. So I think what we need to see is further transparency. I don't think we can go backwards. I don't necessarily think you can ask these universities to refund that money, to dismantle anything. But it is a something for us to think about in the future. And when universities are accepting these funds, we really need to think about where is it coming from, and is it coming from a source that we feel comfortable with, and being transparent about that.
Tony is waiting to ask a call. We're getting short on time. So, Tony, I'm going to paraphrase your question that you asked related to the harmful impact of methadone. Have had loved ones that have been taking methadone. What can you say there to answer her question about the impact of methadone, Steve?
Well, I mean, there's going to be harm with any medication, right? We see harm with all of the medications we use, even antihypertensive medications treating blood pressure. We see harm with drugs to treat cholesterol. We see harm with drugs to treat diabetes. It's all in the context of how these meds are used. Now, certainly, people aren't benefiting, from those drugs from a psychological standpoint like we do with opioids. They're not, getting that euphoria from taking, their antihypertensive medications. So my answer to that would be, certainly any drug can be harmful, and methadone can be as well. But we know that it's safer than the alternatives. And those alternatives are fentanyl and heroin, right? We know those drugs have far-reaching harm that not only are the possibility of overdose, but also increasing rates of hepatitis C infection, HIV infection, and other transmittable diseases, even including tuberculosis. So when we think about the harm benefit, certainly there's much more benefit and safety to using methadone and Suboxone than there is to the alternative, which is using illicit drugs like fentanyl and heroin, particularly by the IV route. And so while I feel for that person's family, and I'm sorry that there's been some harm, the benefits that we've seen have far outweighed those potential harms.
We'll have to leave it there. Steve Wood, again, is an acute care nurse practitioner, a visiting researcher at the Harvard Law School. Thank you for your time today, Steve. Also with us was Alexa Dietrich, research associate professor at Wagner College. Alexa, thank you for your time.
Thanks very much.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show was produced by Sujata Srinivasan and Abhi Levine. Kat Pastor is our technical producer. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel again. We'll be back tomorrow.